The warning comes not in a voice of thunder, but in a whisper meant for a wall. Read wall, read wall. Tear down your house and build a boat. Abandon wealth and seek survival. Spurn possessions and save life. These words pressed into wet clay 5,000 years ago were a God's secret, a loophole against oblivion. You stand now not in ancient Sumer, but in the hushed, climate-controlled quiet of the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. The air is still. Before you, under soft gallery light, lies a fragment of hardened mud no bigger than your palm. It is the colour of dust and time. This is the Epic of Ziusudra. Through the reinforced glass, you see the dense nail-like script of cuneiform, a language of ghosts. And in these tiny wedge-shaped marks is a story you think you know, but you are wrong. This tablet tells of a great flood, a chosen survivor, and an ark filled with animals. But the hero is not Noah. His name is Ziusudra, and his story was already ancient when the Bible was first being written. Hold that image. The quiet room, the silent tablet, the world-shattering secret it holds. Now, wherever you are, take a moment. Feel the space around you. Wherever you're listening tonight, a quiet room in London, a late-night drive in Los Angeles, a study in Lagos, welcome to Sapiens Untold. Where are you listening from? What time is it where you are? Settle in. Get comfortable. Dim the lights if you can. This is a space for the curious, for those who feel the pull of the deep past. If you are one of us, if mysteries like this speak to a part of you that wonders what we've forgotten, hit like and subscribe. You're not just a listener here. You're part of the expedition. Now, let's get closer to that piece of clay. Let's listen to the warning that echoes from the dawn of civilization, from a world on the brink of being washed away. You are no longer in the quiet museum. You're in the world that tablet describes, a world before the rain. You stand in the city of Shuruppak, on the banks of the Euphrates, around 2900 BCE. The air is thick with the smell of river mud, cooking fires, and the dust of 1,000 workshops. Humanity is thriving. The cities are loud, teeming, and vibrant. And up in the heavens, the gods are growing annoyed. The cuneiform tablets tell us a story not of divine judgment on sin, but of celestial irritation. Enlil, chief of the gods, cannot sleep. The noise of humanity, their arguments, their laughter, their endless activity, rises to the heavens like a constant roar, disturbing his divine peace. He convenes the council and makes a decision born of frustration, extinction. A great flood will wipe the slate clean. But one god objects. Enki, who fashioned humanity from clay, cannot bear to see his creation annihilated. Bound by the council's decree, he cannot warn humanity directly. So he devises a plan. You follow him as he drifts unseen to the reed house of the king, Ziusudra, a man described in the texts as pious and humble. Enki doesn't speak to the king, he speaks to the wall. His voice is a low murmur, a rustle in the reeds. Ziusudra, sleeping inside, hears the impossible words seeping through the woven structure of his own home. He's been told to tear down his house to build a boat, to abandon his wealth, to save not himself but the seed of all life. This is Ziusudra's impossible choice. Believe a whisper that promises the end of the world, or trust the solid ground beneath his feet. He chooses the whisper. The ancient texts describe his frantic work, a massive, cube-shaped vessel with multiple decks, waterproofed with black bitumen pitch. His neighbours watch, confused, mocking the king, building a giant boat on dry land. But Ziusudra is driven by a divine deadline. He gathers his family, skilled craftsmen, and pairs of every animal, loading the seeds of civilization into the belly of his vessel. He works against the silent countdown of a coming storm only he knows is on its way. Then the work is done. He seals the door from the inside, plunging his new world into darkness. You are at the bottom of a deep trench dug into the Iraqi desert, at the site of the ancient city of Ur. The sun is a physical weight, baking the clay walls of the excavation around you. The air tastes of dust. Your hands are gritty, tracing the layers in the earth, reading the centuries like pages in a book. Here, a layer of ash from a great fire. Below that, the foundations of a temple. Deeper still, pottery shards from a forgotten dynasty. Each layer tells a story of continuous life, of building and rebuilding, of civilization stacking upon itself for millennia. Then, your trowel hits something different. Not stone, not pottery, not bone. It hits a thick, uniform layer of smooth, sterile clay. The archaeologists who first cut this trench in the 1920s, led by Sir Leonard Woolley, kept digging. They went down 1 meter, then 2, then 3. 10 solid feet of clean, water-laid sediment, utterly empty of artifacts, devoid of any sign of human life. It was a blank page in the book of history, an erasure. And then below those 10 feet of mud, the story started again. They found tools, graves, and the remains of settlements from an even earlier age. Archaeological excavations revealed a clear catastrophic break, a moment when the world of these people was buried under a massive deposit of silt and clay. This is not myth. This is a physical scar left in the earth. Similar flood deposits have been found at other ancient sites, including Kish, Uruk, and even Shuruppak itself, the city where Ziusudra ruled. Geological evidence suggests that a perfect storm of melting mountain snow and torrential seasonal rains could have caused the Tigris and Euphrates rivers to overflow their banks simultaneously, inundating the entire Mesopotamian plain. For the people who lived here, whose entire world was the land between the two rivers, this would not have been a flood. It would have been the flood. You press your hand against the cool, dense clay. This is the event that divides time. The Sumerian king list, one of our oldest historical documents, marks this exact point. It lists the kings who ruled for impossibly long ages, and then it says simply, the flood swept over. After that, history begins again. So if the flood was real, what about the survivor? The sound inside Ziusudra's vessel is of creaking timbers, the low frightened calls of animals, and the ceaseless drumming of rain on the roof. Then the sound changes. It becomes the roar of moving water, a deep grinding as the rivers overflow and the sea rises to meet them. You are inside the ark with him now, feeling the sickening lurch as the great boat is lifted from the dry earth and becomes a toy in the grip of the deluge. The ancient texts describe it with terrifying power. For 7 days and 7 nights the flood swept over the land. The huge boat was tossed about on the great waters. The world outside has disappeared. There is only the darkness of the hull and the violence of the storm. Cities are drowning, mountains are vanishing, everything breathes, everything that walks, everything that had a name is being scoured from the face of the earth. On the 7th day, the roaring subsides. A profound silence descends, broken only by the lapping of water against the hull. Ziusudra cracks open a window and a single ray of sunlight cuts through the stale air. Hope. The boat has grounded on a mountain. To test the world, he releases a dove. It finds no perch, no sign of life, and returns. He sends a swallow. It too returns. Finally, he releases a raven. It finds carrion on the emerging land and does not come back. The water has receded. Ziusudra opens the great door. You step out with him into a world scrubbed clean, silent and empty beneath the sun. The first thing he does is build an altar. He makes a sacrifice to the gods who tried to destroy him. And the texts tell us something extraordinary. The gods, starving for the worship and offerings they had eliminated, smell the roasting meat and gather like flies around his sacrifice. They are filled not with wrath, but with regret. Seeing Ziusudra, Enlil, the very god who ordered the destruction, relents. He blesses the survivor, granting him and his wife immortality, to live forever in the land of Dilmun. The place where the sun rises. The age of gods and monsters is over. The age of humanity, reborn from this single family, is about to begin. This story doesn't just live on one tablet, it echoes. You're in Babylon now, 1,000 years after Ziusudra. The city is the largest in the world, a marvel of hanging gardens and immense ziggurats. You stand before a scribe painstakingly, copying a much older Sumerian tale into the Akkadian language of his empire. This is the Epic of Gilgamesh. The scribe changes the hero's name from Ziusudra to Utnapishtim, but the story he writes is identical. A secret warning from the god Ea, the Babylonian name for Enki. An ark built to escape a flood sent by an enraged Enlil. Animals taken aboard, 2 by 2. The storm, the grounding on a mountain, the release of the birds, a dove, a swallow, a raven, to find dry land. It's the same narrative blueprint preserved and passed on. Now, jump forward another 1,000 years. You are with the Hebrew scribes in exile, captives in this very city of Babylon around 586 BCE. They are surrounded by Babylonian culture, by its stories, its myths, its libraries of cuneiform. They hear the story of Utnapishtim, the immortal flood survivor, and they do what cultures have always done. They adopt the powerful story and adapt it to their own beliefs. The many gods become one god. The divine squabble becomes a singular moral judgment on human wickedness. Utnapishtim becomes Noah, but the striking parallels prove the connection beyond all doubt. A divine warning, a massive boat built to specific instructions, the saving of family and animals, the landing on a mountain, the sending out of birds, the sacrifice offered in thanks, and the divine covenant that follows. These are not coincidences. They are literary DNA. The story spread across cultures like a seed on the wind, taking root in new soil and growing into different forms, but always from the same ancient source. Billions know the name of Noah. They read his story in the book of Genesis, but they are unknowingly reading a story whose origins lie 2,000 years earlier, with a Sumerian king named Ziusudra, who first heard the end of the world whispered through a reed wall. The story is not the only thing that survived. You're back in the quiet halls of a museum, but this time you stand before the Sumerian king list. It is a tall clay prism covered in columns of dense cuneiform, a foundational document of human history. Your eyes trace the lines of kings and cities. The list begins with a simple, profound statement. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. It then lists 8 kings across 5 cities. But something is wrong. Your mind struggles to process the numbers. The first king, Alulim, ruled for 28,800 years. His successor, Alalangar, ruled for 36,000 years. In total, these 8 kings reigned for a combined 241,200 years. Then you reach the chronological marker, the great dividing line in their history. Then the flood swept over. After this line, the text continues. After the flood had swept over, and the kingship had descended from heaven, the kingship was in Kish. The kings who rule after the flood have normal human lifespans. The reigns are measured in decades, not millennia. It is as if history itself was split into 2 distinct epochs, a mythological, almost geological timescale of rulers before the flood, and a tangible, human timescale after. Ziusudra is listed as the last king of Shuruppak, the final ruler of this antediluvian age. So what does this mean? Was the flood a real event so catastrophic that it severed the Sumerians' connection to their own deep past, forcing them to record what came before as a mythic era of god kings? Or does it preserve a memory of something else? A time when humanity perceived the world and the passage of time itself in a way we can no longer comprehend. The trauma of the flood didn't just wipe out cities, it seems to have wiped out an entire mode of being, leaving behind only the strange, impossible numbers carved into this clay prism, a silent testament to a world that was drowned and a history that had to begin again from year 0. You stand at the edge of the Persian Gulf, looking out over the water as the sun sets. The air is warm and salty. Beneath these waves, thousands of years ago, there may have been land. Some researchers propose that the Ziusudra story preserves a memory not of a river flood in 2900 BCE, but of a far older, slower catastrophe. Around 5000 BCE, as the last ice age thawed, melting glaciers caused global sea levels to rise dramatically. The Indian Ocean would have surged into the low-lying Persian Gulf basin, drowning coastal settlements and forcing populations to flee inland, up the river valleys of the Tigris and Euphrates. This rising tide wouldn't have been a 7-day storm, but a relentless generational inundation, the slow, terrifying end of a world. The human cost would have been immense, a trauma seared into the collective memory of the survivors, a story of a lost paradise beneath the waves, passed down orally for 2,000 years before anyone had the technology to write it down. This is the power of a story born from catastrophe. What was lost in that flood? Whichever flood it was. Entire cities, certainly. Libraries of knowledge we will never recover. But the story also reveals what was saved. Ziusudra wasn't just told to save his family and the animals. He was told to save skilled craftsmen, the keepers of technology. He was told to save the seeds of all plants, the foundation of agriculture. His boat wasn't just a lifeboat, it was a civilizational archive. The story of Ziusudra is a reminder that the world can end, and that what survives is not random. It is what we choose to preserve. The survival of this story, passed down through 3 great civilizations, proves its essential truth, whether literal or metaphorical. Humanity has faced extinction before. A remnant survived. And from that remnant, the world was rebuilt. Ziusudra, king, priest, survivor, represents not just the first recorded hero of an apocalypse, but the enduring promise that even after the waters recede, life and memory can find a way to begin again. You are in a workshop surrounded by the smell of cut cypress wood and melting bitumen. The instructions Ziusudra received were not vague. They were a blueprint. The ancient texts, particularly the more detailed Babylonian version, give specific dimensions. The vessel is to be a perfect cube, its length, width, and height all equal. It is to have multiple decks, reinforced ribs, and a strong roof. Every seam must be waterproofed inside and out with pitch, a naturally occurring asphalt plentiful in Mesopotamia. You watch the craftsmen work, their bronze saws and adzes shaping the massive timbers. You feel the urgency in their movements. There is no time to waste. Consider the engineering. A cube is not the most hydrodynamic shape, but it is incredibly stable and offers the maximum possible volume for its surface area. It's a design for survival, not for travel. It's a floating storehouse, a seed bank designed to endure a storm, not to sail to a destination. The multiple decks allow for the separation of animals, the storage of vast amounts of food and water, and living quarters for the human survivors. This is not the work of a primitive people guessing at boat design. The instructions describe a sophisticated, purpose-built survival vessel. And then there is the human cost of belief. Ziusudra had to convince laborers to build this impossible structure. He had to persuade his family to abandon their lives and enter this wooden prison. He faced the ridicule of his people, who saw only a mad king building a monument to a non-existent flood. Every plank of wood, every bucket of pitch was an act of faith against the evidence of a clear blue sky. It's a story about the tension between what is seen and what is known, between the comfort of the present and the terrifying certainty of a foretold future. The construction of the boat was the first test. The second was sealing the door, trusting the warning, and waiting in the dark for the rain to begin. The memory of a great flood is not confined to Mesopotamia. You stand now on a research vessel in the middle of the Black Sea. The water below you is dark and notoriously deep. For millennia, this sea was a vast freshwater lake, completely cut off from the world's oceans, its shoreline dotted with Neolithic farming villages. But around 75,000 years ago, something happened. Geological evidence suggests that as sea levels rose after the Ice Age, the Mediterranean Sea breached the thin strip of land at the Bosporus. Imagine the sound, a torrent of salt water, hundreds of times more powerful than Niagara Falls, cascading into the freshwater lake. The sea level would have risen by several inches every single day. For the people living on the shores of that ancient lake, it would have been an apocalypse in slow motion. Each morning, the water would be closer to their homes. their fields, their sacred sites. They would have been forced to retreat, abandoning everything, generation after generation, driven inland by the relentless advance of the sea. In 1999, marine geologist Robert Ballard, the man who found the Titanic, used sonar to map the floor of the Black Sea. 100 meters below the surface, he found the unmistakable traces of an ancient coastline, sand dunes, river valleys, and even the preserved remains of wattle and daub houses, perfectly preserved in the anoxic, oxygen-free water at the sea's bottom. Archaeological excavations on the seafloor revealed human-worked timbers and stone tools. This was a lost world, drowned by a cataclysmic flood. Could this event, the Black Sea deluge, be the ultimate origin of the flood myth? A true world-altering catastrophe, whose traumatized survivors spread out across Europe, Anatolia and Mesopotamia, carrying with them a story of the Great Flood that destroyed their world. The dates are older, the geography is different, but the core memory remains the same. The water rose, the world was lost, and only those who fled survived to tell the tale. You are in the control room of a deep-sea submersible, the only light coming from the green glow of sonar screens. The pressure outside is immense. On the main screen, a ghostly landscape materializes from the darkness. You are watching images beamed from a remote-operated vehicle gliding over the floor of the Black Sea, 100 meters down. The sonar paints a picture of a world that hasn't seen sunlight in over 7,000 years. You see the gentle slope of an ancient beach. You see the meandering path of a riverbed, its banks still clearly defined. Then the pilot's voice crackles over the intercom. Target acquired. Moving in. A rectangular shape appears on the screen. It is too perfect, too geometric to be natural. As the ROV gets closer, the high-resolution sonar reveals a distinct texture of worked wood and the clear outline of a collapsed structure. This is one of the drowned houses of the Black Sea. It is a tomb, perfectly preserved in the cold, oxygen-free darkness. The sonar reveals something more. All the drowned settlements found here face the same direction, consistent with being hit by a massive wave front coming from the Bosporus. It paints a picture of a sudden, violent inundation, not a gradual rise. The people who lived here would have had no warning. One day, their world was a placid freshwater lake. The next, a saltwater tsunami was erasing their coastline. This is the chilling reality that archaeology can uncover. The story of a great flood, told first by the Sumerians and echoed through the ages, may not be a single memory. It might be a composite, a story that resonated so deeply with humanity because so many different cultures, in so many different times, had their own experience of a world-ending flood. From the river plains of Mesopotamia to the drowned coast of the Black Sea, the evidence suggests that our species has a long and terrifying history with the awesome destructive power of water. The story of Ziusudra is not just myth. It is a memory that sleeps in the mud, waiting for us to find it. You are in a laboratory kept at a constant -24 degrees Celsius. Your breath freezes in the air. Before you on a long, lighted table lies a cylinder of ice 2 meters long, drilled from the Greenland ice sheet. It is a time capsule. Each layer of compacted snow is a year, and trapped within those layers are bubbles of ancient atmosphere, volcanic ash, and cosmic dust. A perfect high-resolution climate record stretching back thousands of years. A scientist points to a section of the core. With your gloved hand, you can feel the faint ridges between the layers. This, she says, is 2900 BCE. You lean closer. The layers from that period are distinct. They show a sudden, dramatic shift in climate. Isotopic analysis reveals a sharp, cooling event, a period of unusually heavy precipitation across the northern hemisphere, likely causing massive glacial melt and torrential rains further south. In Mesopotamia, this would have been the exact recipe for the catastrophic flooding described in the Sumerian text and found in the archaeological record at Ur. The ice core doesn't tell a story of angry gods, but it does tell a story of a planet in turmoil. Here, in the frozen silence of Greenland, is a climate proxy that corroborates the timing of the Sumerian flood. The clay tablets give us the human memory of the event, the terror, the survival, the aftermath. The archaeological layers give us the physical scar it left on the earth, and the ice cores give us the global climatic context, a fingerprint of the atmospheric disturbance that may have triggered it all. These are three independent lines of evidence: mythology, archaeology, and paleoclimatology, all pointing to a single catastrophic moment around 2900 BC. A moment when the world changed. A moment so profound its memory was preserved for 5,000 years. This isn't about proving a myth true. It's about realizing that some myths might be the only surviving histories we have of very real events that shape the human story. You remain in the sub-zero laboratory, but the scientist moves you along the timeline captured in the ice. You pass the birth of Rome, the Bronze Age collapse, the building of the pyramids. She stops you at a layer corresponding to approximately 5600 BCE. You look closer at the ice core. The layers here tell a different story, not of cooling, but of a dramatic and sudden warming event at the end of the last ice age. This is the precise time frame for the Black Sea deluge theory. The ice shows a massive pulse of fresh water entering the North Atlantic as the Laurentide ice sheet over North America collapsed. This event, known as the 8.2 kiloyear event, would have caused a rapid rise in global sea levels, exactly the mechanism needed to breach the Bosporus and flood the Black Sea basin. Two separate flood stories, the Mesopotamian and the Black Sea, and two separate climate events recorded in the ice, matching both timelines perfectly. This is where the story becomes deeply complex. We may not be looking for one single flood that inspired the myth. We may be looking at a recurring pattern, an echo in our collective memory. Our species evolved during the Pleistocene, an era of violent climate shifts, of advancing and retreating ice, of rising and falling seas. Catastrophic flooding was not a one-time event. It was a recurring feature of the prehistoric world. Is it possible that the story of Ziusudra, passed down for millennia, became a vessel itself? A narrative arc that could carry the memory of multiple catastrophes, blending the details of a Mesopotamian river flood with the deeper, older trauma of a drowned sea coast. The story's incredible power, its ability to survive for 5,000 years, may come from its resonance with a fundamental truth of human experience. The world we know is fragile, the climate is not stable, and the waters can rise. The ice core doesn't just record the weather, it records the backdrop against which our oldest stories were written. You are standing on a barren hilltop in southeastern Turkey under a vast empty sky. The wind whips dust around you. This is Göbekli Tepe, and it changes everything. Orthodox archaeology told us that complex civilization began with agriculture, that people settled down to farm, then built villages, then cities, then temples. Göbekli Tepe reverses that timeline. You walk among circles of massive T-shaped limestone pillars, some weighing over 10 tons. They were carved, moved and erected 12,000 years ago by people who were supposedly nomadic hunter-gatherers. This is 7,000 years before the pyramids, 6,000 years before Stonehenge. Your fingers trace the intricate carvings on the pillars: foxes, boars, vultures, scorpions. This was a temple, a ritual center of immense sophistication, built by people without pottery, without writing, without metal tools. And here is the strangest part. After 2,000 years of use, the people who built Göbekli Tepe did something extraordinary. They deliberately and carefully buried their entire temple complex under thousands of tons of earth, creating the artificial hill you are standing on today. Why would a culture bury its most sacred site? It was an act of immense effort, a final ritual closing of a chapter of human history. Some researchers studying the site's astronomical alignments and carvings believe they know why. The pillars, they argue, are not just a temple, they are a warning. A memorial carved in stone to commemorate a cataclysm that struck the earth around 11,600 years ago, at the end of the last ice age, a period of catastrophic global flooding known as Meltwater Pulse 1b. In this interpretation, the survivors of that cataclysm built Göbekli Tepe, not just to worship, but to remember, to create a message for the future. and when their work was done, they buried it, preserving the memory for a distant future that might be able to decode it. Could this be the true origin of the flood story, a memory of a global event that predates Ziusudra by millennia? A warning buried in the earth from the survivors of the last great reset. You are back on the hilltop at Göbekli Tepe, crouched before one of the giant pillars. Your guide, an archaeologist who has spent a decade at this site, points to a specific carving. It is a vulture depicted with one wing outstretched, holding a circular object, a sphere. Below it are other animals, contorted in unnatural positions. This is not a hunting scene, she says. This is a sky map. Using sophisticated software, researchers have been able to match the arrangement of animals on this pillar to the arrangement of constellations in the sky. Not as they are today, but as they were on a specific date, 10,150 BCE. This is the exact time frame of the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, a controversial but compelling theory that a comet fragmented and struck the Earth, triggering the sudden onset of a mini ice age and causing catastrophic global flooding. The headless man at the bottom of the pillar, they argue, represents the human cost of this event, a civilization-ending cataclysm. The pillar becomes a celestial clock, its carvings marking a precise moment of devastation. This is a level of astronomical knowledge and symbolic communication that is staggering for its age. These were not primitive hunter-gatherers. They were astronomers, engineers, storytellers, and they may have been survivors. What if Göbekli Tepe is a library of stone built by the Ziusudras of their day? A place to preserve the knowledge of a global catastrophe, encoding the date of the event in the sky map on the pillar for anyone in the future with the knowledge to read it. The act of burying the site then becomes an act of preservation, creating a time capsule. Perhaps the story of a great flood didn't begin in Sumer. Perhaps it began here, 12,000 years ago, with the survivors of a cosmic impact who knew they had to leave a warning that the sky can fall, the seas can rise, and that memory is the only thing that can be carried from one world to the next. You are in a geology lab, staring through the eyepiece of a powerful microscope. On the slide is a thin section of rock, shaved to translucent thinness, recovered from a geological layer dated to the Younger Dryas boundary, 12,800 years ago. The rock is from Syria, not far from the Euphrates River Valley. As you adjust the focus, you see them, microspherules, tiny perfect spheres of melted rock, some containing nanodiamonds that can only be formed under the kind of extreme temperature and pressure generated by a cosmic impact. Geological surveys have found this layer of impact proxies, a black mat rich in platinum, melted silica and nanodiamonds stretching across 4 continents. It is the fingerprint of a massive, globally significant event. An event that coincides perfectly with the beginning of the Younger Dryas cold period, a 1,000-year-long winter that saw the extinction of dozens of species of megafauna and brought unimaginable hardship to the human survivors. This is the hard science that may underlie the myth-making. Imagine the survivors of this event. They would have witnessed skies on fire, earthquakes, and then, as the impact destabilized the world's ice sheets, the catastrophic floods of Meltwater Pulse 1b. They would have told stories of this time, of the world before and the world after, and those stories, passed down through 200 generations, would have been carried into the fertile crescent of Mesopotamia. The tale of a world-ending flood would not have been an invention, it would have been a foundational memory. When the people of Sumer later experienced their own devastating river flood around 2900 BCE, that older, deeper memory would have been reactivated. The local event would have been seen through the lens of the global myth. Ziusudra's story, then, becomes a powerful convergence point where the geologic memory of a cosmic catastrophe meets the historical memory of a regional flood, creating a story so potent it would echo for the rest of human history. You are kneeling in the dust of a dry riverbed in North America, thousands of miles from Mesopotamia. But the story is the same. an archaeologist hands you a piece of flint, a Clovis point, the signature tool of the first people of this continent. It dates to just before the Younger Dryas. Immediately above the layer where these tools are found is the black mat, that thin, dark layer of carbon-rich soil, devoid of artifacts and megafauna fossils. It is a geological tombstone, marking the abrupt end of the Clovis culture 800 years ago. You run your thumb over the flint, cold, ancient. The people who made this vanished at the same time the mammoths and saber-toothed cats did. They were casualties of the Younger Dryas event. Their world ended. Their cultures were shattered. But some people survived, and the stories they told are still with us. You can hear echoes of this cataclysm in the oral traditions of indigenous peoples across North America. Stories of a time of fire and flood, of a great winter that descended upon the world, and of the few who survived to begin the world anew. The story of the Great Flood is not one story, it is a human story. It has been told on every continent, in hundreds of cultures for thousands of years. The details change. The hero might be Ziusudra or Noah, or the Hopi's spider grandmother, or the Ojibwe's Nanabozo. But the core narrative persists. The world that was is destroyed by water, and a new world is born from a handful of the survivors. This is not proof of a single global flood. It is proof of a shared human experience with catastrophe, and the incredible resilience of both memory and hope. The Sumerian story is the first time this memory was written down, the first time this oral tradition was captured in clay. But the story itself is far, far older. It is a ghost that has haunted our species since the last ice age, a reminder that we are all the children of the survivors. You are in the digital simulation lab of a naval architecture firm. On a massive screen before you, a 3D model of Ziusudra's ark, a perfect cube, is being battered by a simulated storm. You have provided the engineers with the descriptions from the ancient texts, the cubical shape, the internal bracing, the bitumen coating. Now they are running the numbers. The lead engineer points to the screen. A cube is a terrible design for a ship, he says. It has immense drag. You couldn't sail it anywhere. Then he smiles. But you're not trying to sail it. You're trying to survive in it. He pulls up a new set of data. The simulation shows that the cube's shape makes it incredibly stable. It is virtually impossible to capsize. While a traditional boat might be rolled by a massive wave, the cube simply gets pushed, bobbing on the surface like a cork. The design isn't for travel, it's for endurance. The internal decks and bracing described in the text provide immense structural integrity, allowing the vessel to withstand the crushing forces of a tsunami-like wave. The engineers conclude that while it may be an unconventional design, it is a brilliantly effective one for a single purpose: surviving a deluge. The instructions passed down to Ziusudra were not just a mythic fancy. They were a viable engineering solution to a specific and terrifying problem. This raises a haunting question. Where did this knowledge come from? Was it the result of divine inspiration, as the texts claim, or was it the product of a much older, forgotten maritime tradition? A body of knowledge accumulated by a seafaring people who had experience with such catastrophes and who encoded the blueprint for survival in a story, a sacred instruction passed down to ensure that the next time the waters rose, someone would be ready. The ark itself is an artifact, a piece of lost technology preserved not in stone or metal, but in a story. You stand once more in the quiet of the Ashmolean Museum, looking at the small clay fragment that started this journey. The cuneiform is silent, the glass is cold, but the story it tells is no longer a simple myth. It is a complex echo layered with the traumas of deep time. The story of Ziusudra is a focal point where multiple histories converge. The geological reality of river floods in Mesopotamia, the climatic turmoil recorded in the ice, the cultural transmission across empires, and perhaps a far more ancient memory of a global cataclysm at the end of the Ice Age. Why do we tell this story? Why has it survived for 5,000 years? adapting and changing as it spread from Sumer to Babylon to Jerusalem and then to the entire world, because it speaks to a fundamental human truth. The world is not safe. Order can collapse into chaos in an instant. But the story is not just about the flood. It's about the ark. It's about the survivor. It's about the act of preservation, of choosing what is worth saving when everything is about to be lost. Ziusudra, the pious king, represents that choice. Whether a real historical figure or a legendary archetype, he embodies the idea that in the face of annihilation, our most important task is to build a vessel to carry knowledge, culture, and life itself across the dark water, from the world that is ending to the world that is waiting to be born. In the end, the story is not about divine anger or human sin. It is about the stubborn, defiant act of survival. You look at the tablet one last time. Billions know the name Noah, but his story began here, with Ziusudra, the Sumerian king who listened to a whisper in a reed wall, and in doing so saved the future. His is the original story of hope in the face of the apocalypse, a message in a bottle from the dawn of history, telling us that the flood will always come, but that we have the power to build the ark. You are thousands of miles east of Sumer, high in the thin, cold air of the Himalayas. Prayer flags snap in the wind. You sit with a Hindu scholar in a monastery that clings to the side of a mountain. He unrolls a fragile manuscript and begins to read. It is a story of Manu from the ancient Sanskrit text, the Matsya Purana. One day, as Manu washes his hands in a river, a tiny fish swims into his palms and begs for protection. Manu keeps the fish, moving it to larger and larger containers as it grows at an impossible rate. Finally, the fish, now a giant, reveals that he is an avatar of the god Vishnu. He warns Manu of a coming deluge that will destroy the world and instructs him to build a great ship and gather the seeds of all life, along with 7 great sages. The parallels are unmistakable. A divine warning of a world-ending flood. A chosen man tasked with building a boat. The preservation of life and knowledge. When the flood comes, Manu ties his ship to the horn of the great fish, Vishnu, who guides him safely through the storm until the waters recede and he can land on a mountain peak. The story spread across cultures, its path illuminated by striking parallels, from Ziusudra in Sumer to Utnapishtim in Babylon, to Noah in Israel, to Manu in India. The narrative blueprint remains constant. This is not proof that they all record the same event, but it is powerful evidence of a shared ancestral story, a proto-myth that originated in a single place and time, then spread with migrating peoples across the ancient world, each culture adapting the tale to fit its own gods and its own geography. This story was a piece of essential cultural technology, a warning and a message of hope carried from the heart of a forgotten catastrophe, echoing down through millennia until it became the foundation of faiths practiced by billions today. The search for the flood is not a search for one location. It is a search for the origin of one of humanity's most powerful ideas. You are in a quiet library, turning the pages of a linguistic atlas. You trace the branching pathways of language families following words back in time. Linguists have reconstructed a hypothetical mother tongue, Proto-Indo-European, spoken some 6,000 years ago on the steppes of Eurasia. By tracing shared root words for concepts like wheel, horse, and father, they can rebuild the vocabulary of a lost people. They can do the same with stories. By comparing the myths of derivative cultures, Vedic India, ancient Greece, Norse Scandinavia, they can reconstruct the core elements of a Proto-Indo-European mythology. And at the heart of that reconstructed mythology, they find a story of a world-ending winter, followed by a world-ending flood. They find a story of a heroic survivor who builds a vessel, saves a remnant of life, and sacrifices to the gods to begin the world anew. The details are remarkably similar to the stories of Manu and Ziusudra. This suggests that the flood myth is not just a Semitic or Mesopotamian tradition, it is a foundational story of the Indo-European peoples as well, pointing to an origin point far earlier and geographically separate from Sumer. This is where the trails converge. The survivors of the Black Sea deluge, fleeing inland around 5600 BCE, would have spoken an early form of Proto-Indo-European. They would have carried their trauma and their stories with them. One branch of these migrants would move west into Europe, their story eventually becoming the Norse tale of Bergelmir surviving Ragnarok's flood in a wooden chest. Another branch would move southeast towards Mesopotamia and India. Their story of a great flood, born from the real geological trauma of the Black Sea's inundation, would have eventually encountered the Sumerian civilization. There, this ancient memory would merge with local traditions of river floods, crystallizing around the historical figure of a king named Ziusudra, and finally, for the first time in human history, being written down. The story on the clay tablet is not an invention. It is the end point of a journey thousands of years and thousands of miles long. You stand on a high mesa in Arizona, the red rock warm beneath your feet. The desert landscape stretches to the horizon, vast and silent. You are in the heartland of the Hopi people, a culture that has lived continuously in this region for over 1,000 years. An elder sits before you, his face a map of time, and he tells you the story passed down to him. It is not myth to him, it is history. He tells you that this is the fourth world. The previous three worlds were destroyed by the Creator because humanity had lost its way. The first world was destroyed by fire. The second world was destroyed by ice. And the third world, a technologically advanced civilization that lost its spiritual connection to the earth, was destroyed by a great flood. The elder's voice is quiet but firm. He describes how the righteous people were warned by Spider Grandmother. She instructed them to hollow out great reeds, seal them with pitch, and place inside the seeds of life and a remnant of the faithful people. They floated upon the great waters in the darkness until they saw a light and emerged here, into the fourth world. You feel a chill despite the desert heat. A divine warning, a sealed vessel, the preservation of seeds, the survival of a righteous few, the emergence into a new world. The parallels to Ziusudra's story are too precise to be ignored, but there is no linguistic or archaeological evidence of contact between ancient Mesopotamia and the American Southwest. So how is this possible? Is it proof of a shared, global catastrophe whose memory was preserved independently by cultures all over the world? Or does it speak to something deeper about the human psyche? A universal archetype, an innate story hardwired into our collective unconscious, that emerges whenever civilizations face collapse. Whether it is a shared history or a shared psychology, the Hopi story is a powerful testament to the story's endurance. It reminds us that the flood is not just a story from the past, it is also a prophecy, a cyclical pattern of destruction and renewal that, in the Hopi worldview, is destined to repeat again. You descend a wooden ladder into the cool subterranean dark of a kiva, a sacred ceremonial chamber dug into the earth of the Hopi Mesa. The air is still, smelling of clay and wood smoke. Petroglyphs cover the walls. Your guide, the same elder from before, points to a spiral symbol pecked into the rock. This is our journey, he says. We emerge from the previous world through the Sipapu, the opening. He traces the spiral outwards. We move through this world, but it is not the last. The Hopi worldview is cyclical. There is no final judgment, no permanent paradise. There are worlds, and each world has a purpose. When humanity falls out of balance, when we forget our connection to the Creator and to the earth, that world ends, and a new one begins. The flood that destroyed the third world was not a punishment so much as a consequence, a purification, a necessary reset to allow life to continue. This is a profound philosophical difference from the Mesopotamian and biblical traditions. In the Epic of Ziusudra, the gods destroy humanity out of annoyance and then regret their decision. It is a story of a divine impulsiveness and fallibility. In the Bible, God destroys humanity out of moral judgment, punishing wickedness. It is a story of divine justice. But for the Hopi, The destruction is part of a natural recurring cycle. It is not about the gods at all. It is about us. It is about our responsibility to live in balance. The story, in this context, becomes less about the past and more about the future. It is not just a memory, but an ongoing prophecy. The elder looks at you, his eyes holding the weight of a knowledge passed down for 100 generations. He tells you that the fourth world, our world, is also showing signs of falling out of balance. The story of the flood is a reminder that our world too is fragile. It is a call to remember what the people of the third world forgot. It is an impossible choice offered to every generation. Find balance or face the water. You are weightless, suspended in a world of silent blue. The only sound is the rhythmic hiss of your regulator. 25 meters below the surface of the East China Sea, off the coast of the Japanese island of Yonaguni, a vast stone structure emerges from the gloom. It is a monolith the size of a football field, rising from the seabed in a series of immense terraced platforms. You swim along a wall of rock that appears to be a perfectly carved staircase, each step taller than you are. You see right angles, parallel lines, and immense terraces that defy natural explanation. Mainstream geology insists this is a natural formation, a trick of sandstone fracturing. But other researchers, including marine geologist Masaki Kimura, have spent years mapping the site, identifying what they claim are unmistakable signs of human artifice. A retaining wall, a drainage channel, even a stone carving that resembles a human face. The structure, they argue, is a man-made monument, a vast ceremonial centre that was submerged by rising seas at the end of the last ice age, at least 10,000 years ago. If they are right, this is evidence of a sophisticated, megalithic civilization that existed during a time when, according to conventional history, none should have. A civilization lost to the sea. You place your hand on one of the massive stone blocks. It is cool and covered in marine life, but the sheer scale and apparent precision are breathtaking. Whether natural or man-made, Yonaguni is another piece of the puzzle. It is a physical reminder that the coastlines of our world are not fixed. At the end of the last ice age, sea levels were 120 meters lower than they are today. Vast areas of what is now the seafloor were once dry land, home to coastal populations whose villages, cities, and sacred sites were all drowned by the rising waters. Their worlds ended in flood. Is it so difficult to believe that some of them might have left stories behind? Stories that sound very much like Ziusudra's. You are floating above a different submerged landscape, this time in the Gulf of Kambat, off the coast of India. In 2001, oceanographers conducting a survey of the seabed discovered something astonishing. The distinct, gridded outlines of two large cities stretching for miles along the banks of an ancient, submerged river. Subsequent dredging operations have brought up a stunning collection of artifacts, geometric pottery, beads, sculptures, and human remains. One piece of wood from the site has been carbon dated to 7500 BCE. That's 9500 years ago. If this date is correct, it would make these cities the oldest in the world by 5,000 years, predating the earliest Sumerian cities by a margin that rewrites every textbook on human history. Like Yonaguni, these cities were drowned by the rising seas at the end of the last ice age. They are a ghost of a lost chapter of the human story, a civilization that flourished and then vanished beneath the waves. And it is here in India that we find the story of Manu and the great fish. Is it a coincidence that a culture with one of the world's most detailed flood myths is also the site of one of the world's most spectacular underwater ruins? Or are we seeing a direct connection, a memory passed down through the ages, of a time when the great cities of their ancestors were swallowed by the rising tide? The story of Manu ceases to be a simple myth and becomes a potential historical account, a survivor's testimony from a civilization we are only just beginning to rediscover. The evidence for a lost seafaring civilization that was devastated by the Ice Age floods is mounting, from the drowned coasts of the Black Sea to the submerged structures of Japan and India. Perhaps the story of Ziusudra is not the beginning of the story, but the end of a much longer one. The first time the memory of this global trauma was finally written down, thousands of years after the waters rose. You are deep inside the earth, crawling through a low, narrow passage built from massive, perfectly cut stones. The air is cool and still. You are in Maeshowe, a 5,000-year-old chambered tomb on the Orkney Islands, off the northern coast of Scotland. This structure is a masterpiece of Neolithic engineering, built a century before the first pyramids. It was constructed by a mysterious culture of seafarers who left behind hundreds of stone circles, villages, and tombs across these remote islands. You emerge into the central chamber. The stonework is flawless, the massive flagstones fitted together with a precision we would struggle to replicate today. This chamber was designed for a single extraordinary purpose. For a few weeks around the winter solstice, the light of the setting sun shines directly down the long entrance passage, illuminating the back wall of the chamber in a flash of brilliant red light. It is an astronomical observatory, a clock, and a tomb all in one. But the people of Maeshowe were part of a culture that stretched far beyond these islands. They were part of a maritime network that connected Britain to the coasts of Europe. And their myths, preserved in later Norse traditions, speak of a great flood, a world-ending winter, and a few survivors who repopulated the world. They speak of a time when the seas rose and drowned their ancestral lands. Here, in this perfectly aligned stone chamber, you are in the presence of a lost science. These people were not primitive. They were sophisticated astronomers and engineers. They had a deep, multi-generational understanding of the world and the cosmos, and they too carried a memory of a great flood. The question is no longer whether the flood story is true. The question is, which flood? And what other knowledge did the survivors of that drowned world carry with them into the New Age? You are no longer deep inside the earth, but high above it, in the silent, temperature-controlled dome of a planetarium. The star field above you is not the sky of today, but the sky of 5,000 years ago, precisely recreated. An archaeoastronomer sits beside you in the dark. On the dome, she projects an image of the Maeshowe tomb, its long passage glowing. They weren't just farmers, she says. They were watching the sky, and they were keeping time, very, very long time. She explains that many of these Neolithic sites, from Maeshowe to Stonehenge, are aligned to track not just the solar year, but a much slower cycle. The precession of the equinoxes, the slow 26,000-year wobble of the Earth's axis. To even notice this cycle, let alone build massive stone observatories to track it, requires thousands of years of continuous meticulous observation passed down through generations. This is not the work of a culture that believes the world is static. This is the work of a culture that understands deep time and cyclical change. The myths of these people speak of world ages, of cycles of creation and destruction, often linked to celestial events. The Vedic yugas, the Mayan great cycles, the Hopi worlds, all are expressions of this same understanding. The flood is not just a random event, but a marker, a turning of a great cosmic wheel. Now, think back to Ziusudra. His story is told by the Sumerians, the civilization that gave us astronomy, the zodiac, the division of the circle into 360 degrees. Is it possible that the warning he received was not from a god whispering through a wall, but from a priest astronomer, a keeper of this ancient science, a man who understood the long cycles, who saw the warning signs in the climate and the stars, and who knew that the time for the great flood had come again? The story of divine intervention may be a mythic retelling of a scientific prediction, a preserved memory of a lost science that was able to read the signs of coming catastrophe. The whisper from the god Enki may have been the last echo of a forgotten human wisdom. You are standing on the shore of Lake Titicaca, high in the Bolivian Andes. At 12,500 feet, the air is painfully thin, and the water is a deep, impossible blue. According to the foundational myths of the Inca and the pre-Inca peoples of this region, this lake is the center of the world. It was here that the creator god, Viracocha, emerged from the waters after a great flood, called the Unu Pachacuti, had wiped out a race of giants who disobeyed him. He then travelled to the nearby site of Tiwanaku, where he created a new race of human beings from stone. You travel to the ruins of Tiwanaku. Orthodox archaeology dates the site to around 1,500 years ago, but the site's mythology and some geological evidence suggests a far greater antiquity. You stand before the Gateway of the Sun, a single 10-ton block of andesite carved with breathtaking precision. On it is the image of Viracocha, tears streaming from his eyes holding thunderbolts in his hands. The legends say he wept for the world he had destroyed. Here again, half a world away from Sumer, you find the same narrative elements: a creator god, a world-ending flood, a remnant of humanity created anew in the aftermath. But the story has a unique flavor. The destruction is not a mistake, but a necessary cleansing. The creator is not annoyed, but sorrowful. And the flood is just one part of a great cycle of world creations and destructions. There is no direct link between the Andes and Mesopotamia. Yet the same story is told. This is what haunts us. Is it possible that the Unu Pachacuti of the Andes, the great flood of Ziusudra, and the Younger Dryas cataclysm are all different cultural memories of the same global event? An event so profound that its echo was preserved for 12,000 years in every corner of the globe by the scattered descendants of the few who survived. The story is the last and most enduring artifact of a lost world. The story of Viracocha contains another layer, one that resonates with myths from around the globe. He is not just a creator, he is a teacher. The legends describe him as a tall, bearded, pale-skinned man who came from the sea. He travelled through the Andes after the flood, teaching the survivors the arts of civilization: agriculture, astronomy, metallurgy, and law. He was a civilizing hero, a bringer of knowledge. After his work was done, he walked west, across the Pacific, promising to one day return. You hear this story and you feel a sense of impossible recognition. The Sumerian god Enki, who saved Ziusudra, was also a god of wisdom, a master craftsman who taught humanity the arts and sciences. The Egyptian god Osiris was a culture bearer who brought agriculture and law to his people before being murdered and resurrected. The Aztec god Quetzalcoatl was a bearded, light-skinned king who came from the east, taught the arts of civilization, and sailed away, promising to return. This is a global mythological motif. The civilizing hero who comes from a drowned, antediluvian world to teach the survivors of the cataclysm. Are these all independent inventions, or are they too a fragmented memory of a real event? The memory of a lost seafaring civilization, scattered by the floods at the end of the last ice age, whose survivors travelled the world, carrying with them the seeds of knowledge from the world that was. It's a radical idea, and there is no definitive proof. But as you stand before the weeping god at Tiwanaku, you can't help but wonder. Perhaps the story of the flood is not just about destruction. Perhaps it is also a story about transmission. The story of how the knowledge of a drowned world was carried to the four corners of the new one by a handful of survivors who the scattered, traumatized tribes of humanity would remember forever as gods. You are back in Mesopotamia, standing in the ruins of Eridu, the first city on the Sumerian king list, the place where kingship first descended from heaven. The wind blows sand across crumbling mud brick walls. It was here, the legends say, that civilization began, and it began with teachers who came from the sea. Sumerian texts describe 7 sages, the Apkallu, who emerged from the Persian Gulf in the time before the Great Flood. They are described as being part fish, part human, and they are credited with giving humanity all the foundational knowledge of civilization: writing, law, architecture, agriculture, and magic. They were servants of the god Enki, the same god who would later save Ziusudra. The Apkallu lived with humanity in the antediluvian cities, advising the first kings and teaching the arts of civilization. Then, the flood swept everything away. Only the knowledge they had imparted remained, preserved in the memory of the survivors and written down by the scribes of the New Age. This is the same pattern you saw in the Andes, a group of civilizing heroes associated with the sea who bring knowledge to a primitive humanity in a remote epoch before a world-ending flood. In India, Manu is accompanied on his ark by 7 great sages, the Saptarishi, who carry the sacred Vedas, the books of knowledge, safely through the deluge. The number 7 echoes, 7 sages, 7 days of flood, 7 birds. This is not a coincidence, it is a signature. A recurring motif in a story that seems to have been deliberately encoded with sacred numbers and astronomical knowledge. Who were these 7 sages? Were they historical figures, the priest astronomers of a lost civilization? Were they a brotherhood of knowledge, dedicated to preserving the wisdom of their drowned world? Or are they a metaphor for the 7 bright stars of the Pleiades, a constellation deeply sacred to ancient cultures worldwide and often associated with cataclysm? The texts are silent, but the pattern is there, a ghost in the machine of myth, hinting that the story of Ziusudra is not just about one man's survival, but about the preservation of a sacred ancient wisdom. You are standing in the Vatican Library, a place of profound silence and the scent of old parchment. A librarian wearing white gloves places a book on a velvet cradle before you. It is a 16th century copy of the works of Berossus, a Babylonian priest who lived in the 3rd century BCE. He wrote a history of his country in Greek, drawing on temple archives that are now lost to us. His work survives only in fragments, quoted by later historians. You read his account of the time before the Great Flood. He writes of a race of men who were lawless and abominable. He speaks of a king named Ziusudra, a Greek rendering of the Sumerian name Ziusudra. He tells a story of the god Cronus appearing to Ziusudra in a dream, warning him of a coming flood and commanding him to build a great ship. The details are familiar. Ziusudra is to take his family, his friends, and 2 of every animal. But Berossus adds a crucial detail. Cronus also commands Ziusudra to gather up all the sacred writings and bury them in the city of Sippar, the city of the sun god, so that the knowledge of the antediluvian world would not be lost. After the flood, when the ship has grounded in the mountains, Ziusudra sends his family and friends to unearth the sacred texts. They do so, and from these recovered writings, civilization begins again. This is a story about a library, about a deliberate act of knowledge preservation in the face of apocalypse. The Ark was not just for living things, it was also a map to a buried archive. The 7 sages, the Apkallu, were the keepers of this knowledge. Berossus tells us that the first of them, Oannes, a being who was half man, half fish, emerged from the Erythraean Sea to teach humanity the lost arts. He taught them how to found temples, compile laws, and understand geometry. He gave them writing and agriculture. He gave them everything. The flood story is not just a tale of destruction. It is an account of a desperate and successful effort to ensure that civilization itself would survive. You are standing in a university archive, looking at a timeline of human civilization. The line begins around 4000 BCE with the Sumerians, moves through Egypt, Greece, Rome, and up to the present day. It is a neat linear progression, but the evidence you have seen on this journey shatters that timeline. Göbekli Tepe appears on the chart 7,000 years before Sumer, a vast megalithic temple built by hunter-gatherers. The drowned cities in the Gulf of Kampat push urbanism back another 2,000 years. The astronomical knowledge encoded at Maishao speaks to a scientific tradition that must be thousands of years old. The flood myths and the geological evidence that supports them suggest a reason for this shattered timeline. They speak of a great forgetting, a moment or perhaps a series of moments when an advanced global human culture was all but wiped out. The Sumerian king list explicitly divides history into a pre-flood and a post-flood era. The impossible lifespans of the pre-flood kings may be a mythologized way of saying that the world before the cataclysm was incomprehensibly ancient, its history lost to the waters. What we call the beginning of history with Sumerian in 4000 BCE may not be the beginning at all. It may be the beginning of the recovery, the first flickering of a new dawn after a long, dark night. The legends of the seven sages, the Apkallu, the bringers of civilization, now make a chilling kind of sense. They are the memory of the survivors of that earlier age, the keepers of the antediluvian knowledge, who emerged after the cataclysm to reteach a traumatized, shattered humanity the arts of civilization. Ziusudra's story is the hinge. It is the moment when the last king of the old world becomes the first man of the new. He is the bridge between the two ages, the one who carries the seed of the past into the soil of the future. The flood was not the end of the story, it was the end of a chapter. And the story we have been telling ourselves about our own origins may be missing the first half of the book. You stand before a map of the world, but it is not a modern map. It is a map from 1513, created by an Ottoman admiral named Piri Reis. He claimed to have compiled it from much older source maps, some dating back to the time of Alexander the Great. The map shows the coasts of Europe, Africa and South America with astonishing accuracy, but it also shows something impossible, a detailed, ice-free coastline of Antarctica. The last time Antarctica was free of ice was millions of years ago, long before human beings existed. Or was it? Some cartographic historians argue the map shows not a fully ice-free continent, but the coastline as it would appear under the ice, mapped by a technology that we have only recently developed. The implication is staggering, that an ancient seafaring civilization possessed the ability to accurately map the globe, including continents now buried under miles of ice. This is the phantom civilization that haunts the edges of our history, the civilization erased from the maps by the rising waters, the people who built Göbekli Tepe, who quarried the stones of Tiwanaku, who perhaps laid the foundations of the structure at Yonaguni, the people whose survivors became the Apkallu, the seven sages, the bringers of knowledge. This is a story of a global cataclysm, a great forgetting, and a long, slow recovery. The flood didn't just drown coastlines, it drowned a chapter of the human story. Ziusudra's flood then becomes one of the last most vivid echoes of that greater cataclysm. The Mesopotamian flood of 2900 BCE was a real devastating event, but it struck a people who already carried the ancestral memory of a far greater flood in their myths and sacred stories. The local disaster resonated with the global trauma, and the story they told became charged with a power that would ensure its survival for another 5,000 years. The flood swept over, but the story somehow endured. You are walking through the humid, mangrove-lined coast of Arnhem Land in northern Australia. The air is thick with the calls of unseen birds. You are with an elder of the local Yolngu people, one of the oldest continuous cultures on Earth. He takes you to a rock shelter, and on the ancient stone walls, he shows you paintings that are thousands of years old. He tells you the stories that go with them, stories that his ancestors have been telling for 60,000 years. Many of these stories describe the landscape as it was during the last ice age. They speak of a time when the sea was much lower and Australia was part of a larger continent called Sahul. They describe coastlines that are now more than 100 kilometers offshore. They contain detailed, accurate geographical information about a drowned world. These are not myths. They are oral maps, memories of a lost geography preserved for over 10,000 years. Aboriginal traditions from across Australia tell of the rising of the seas. The Lardil people of Mornington Island tell how their island was once part of the mainland, and they remember the names of the drowned rivers and forests. These stories are geological records passed down with perfect fidelity from generation to generation. They prove that oral tradition can preserve accurate information across timescales that seem impossible to us. This is the final piece of the puzzle. We have seen that catastrophic floods are a geological reality. We have seen that ancient cultures possessed a sophisticated knowledge of astronomy and engineering. And here, in Australia, we see proof that human beings are capable of preserving the memory of those events, not just for centuries, but for millennia. The story of Ziusudra is not just plausible, it begins to feel inevitable. When a catastrophe strikes, the survivors will tell stories, and those stories will be preserved. They will become the sacred texts, the foundational myths, the ghost stories of a culture. They are the echoes of the last time the world ended, and they are a warning that it will, one day, end again. You are sitting once more before the Hopi elder on the Arizona mesa. The sun is low, painting the desert in shades of orange and purple. You have traveled the world, chasing the ghost of a flood. You have seen the evidence in the Mesopotamian mud, in the Greenland ice, on the floor of the Black Sea. You have heard the stories echo in Sumer, Babylon, India, and the Andes. You ask the elder one last question. How did his ancestors know? How did they preserve their story for so long? He doesn't answer directly. Instead, he points to a young boy who is sitting quietly nearby, listening. We teach the children, he says simply. We make them learn the stories, exactly as we were taught. Every word, every symbol. The stories are more than a story. It is our connection to the worlds that came before. It is our instruction manual for the world that is to come. To forget the story is to lose our way. You look at the boy and you understand. You are looking at a living library, a tradition of knowledge preservation that is far older and perhaps more resilient than writing. The story of the flood has survived because it was deemed essential. It contains the most important information our species has ever learned, that our world is fragile, that catastrophes happen, and that the key to survival is preparation, preservation, and the courage to begin again. The story of Ziusudra is our story. It is the oldest written record of humanity's brush with extinction, but the memory it contains is far older. It is a legacy passed down to us from the survivors of a forgotten cataclysm. Whether that cataclysm was a river flood, a rising sea, or a cosmic impact, the message is the same. The waters will rise again. The question is, will we be ready? Will we have listened to the whispers? Will we have built our ark? You are sitting by a crackling fire somewhere quiet at the journey's end. The faces and places blur into one another. The museum in Oxford, the trench at Ur, the submersible in the Black Sea, the hilltop in Turkey, the kiva in Arizona, the planetarium, the library, the rock shelter in Arnhem Land. You have been chasing a single story across the globe and through 12,000 years of human history. So what is the answer? Was there one flood or many? Was Ziusudra a historical king, a legendary hero, or a symbol for a lost science? The evidence suggests the answer is all of the above. There was a real catastrophic flood in Mesopotamia around 2900 BCE, an event seared into the memory of the Sumerian people. But that event was interpreted through the lens of a much older and more universal story, a story of a global cataclysm at the end of the last ice age, a memory preserved in dozens of cultures around the world. This older story tells of a sophisticated human civilization that was all but destroyed. Its survivors, the keepers of its knowledge, scattered across the globe, kickstarting the recovery of civilization in places like Sumer and Egypt. They were remembered as gods, sages, and civilizing heroes. The story of Ziusudra is therefore the most important historical document we have. It is the first time this deep ancestral memory was committed to writing. It is the point where the oral tradition of the Ice Age survivors finally enters the historical record. The names change, Ziusudra, Utnapishtim, Noah, Manu, Viracocha, but the message remains the same. Our civilization is not the first. There was another world before this one. It was lost to the water, and we are the children of those who survived. The story is a warning, an instruction manual, and a promise. It is the ghost of a drowned world, whispering to us across the millennia, reminding us where we came from and what we stand to lose. You are standing alone on a beach at night, looking out at the dark water. The waves are gentle, rhythmic, but you know now that the sea is not always calm. You know that the ground beneath your feet is not as solid as it seems. You have followed the story of Ziusudra back in time from a single clay tablet to the very end of the Ice Age, and you have found a ghost haunting our history, a memory of a great cataclysm. This memory has shaped us in ways we are only beginning to understand. It has given us our gods and our demons, our stories of creation and destruction, our deepest fears and our most enduring hopes. The trauma of the flood echoes in our religions, our myths, and our art. It is the story we tell ourselves when we are afraid of the dark, a reminder that the world has ended before, but that humanity has always found a way to survive. Ziusudra is the first hero of this story, the first name given to the archetype of the survivor. He is the keeper of the flame, the man who builds the ark when everyone else is laughing, the one who preserves the seeds of the old world to plant in the new. He represents a choice to face catastrophe with foresight, with preparation, and with an unshakable faith in the future. We are living in an age of rising seas and climatic instability. The whispers that Ziusudra heard through the reed wall are growing louder. The story of the Great Flood is no longer just a story about the past. It is a warning for our present and a question for our future. When the waters rise again, who will build the ark? What knowledge, what seeds, what stories will we choose to save? The legacy of the flood is not just a memory, it is a responsibility. And the final chapter of the story has not yet been written. You are back where you began, in the hushed gallery of the Ashmolean Museum. The small clay tablet sits unchanged in its case, but you see it differently now. It is no longer just a fragment of an ancient myth. It is a key. A single, precisely dated point in a vast, sprawling map of human memory that stretches back into the depths of the Ice Age. The cuneiform marks are a code. They contain the story of Ziusudra, the last king of a drowned world, but encoded within his story is the story of Manu, of Viracocha, of the Seven Sages, and of the unnamed survivors who carved their warning into the pillars of Göbekli Tepe. The tablet is a palimpsest, a document on which older, fainter stories have been overwritten, but whose traces are still visible if you know how to look. The story tells us that the gods destroyed humanity because they were too noisy. It is a strange justification. But perhaps noise is a metaphor. Perhaps it means a civilization that had grown too complex, too disconnected from the natural world, a civilization that had lost its balance. Perhaps the gods who ordered the destruction and the god who offered the warning are not external beings, but symbols for two competing forces within humanity itself. The impulse towards self-destruction and the instinct for survival. Enlil, the god of the storm, represents the forces of chaos and entropy that will eventually overwhelm any civilization. Enki, the god of wisdom, represents the foresight, the knowledge, and the will to preserve that which is essential. The story of Ziusudra is a story of that eternal struggle. It is a story that has been playing out for at least 12,000 years, and it is a story that we are still living inside of. The whispers of Enki have not gone silent. The question is whether we, like Ziusudra, are still capable of hearing them. You're in a library again, but this one is digital. On the screen is a genetic map of humanity, a vast and complex family tree built from the DNA of thousands of individuals, both living and ancient. Geneticists can trace our maternal and paternal lineages back through time, following the branches of our shared ancestry into the deep past. And on that map, there are scars. At certain points in our history, the tree narrows dramatically. These are population bottlenecks, moments when the human population crashed, reduced to a tiny remnant from which all subsequent generations are descended. One such bottleneck occurred around 74,000 years ago, coinciding with the super eruption of Mount Toba, a volcanic winter that nearly drove our species to extinction. Another occurs at the end of the last Ice Age. The genetics confirm what the myths have been telling us all along. Our history is not a story of steady progress. It is a story of survival, of bottlenecks and recoveries, of near extinctions and new beginnings. The flood myths are the cultural memory of these genetic bottlenecks. They are the stories our ancestors told to explain why they were so few and why the world seemed so empty. The trauma of the Younger Dryas and the subsequent sea level rise was a defining moment for our species. It was a filter. The cultures that survived were the ones that had the knowledge, the resilience, and the foresight to adapt. They were the cultures that remembered the stories of previous cataclysms. They were the ones who listened to the warnings. The legacy of that Ice Age trauma is written in our DNA. It is carved into the pillars of Göbekli Tepe, and it is preserved in the cuneiform script of the Epic of Ziusudra. The story of the flood is more than a myth. It is the closest thing we have to a unified theory of our own survival. It is a story of how we have, time and again, managed to pull ourselves back from the brink. You are standing at the edge of the ocean, where Ziusudra's journey began. The waves erase your footprints in the wet sand, a small temporary flood. You look out at the horizon, at the vast, indifferent expanse of water that covers 2/3 of our planet. For most of our history, that water was our enemy, the source of our deepest fears, the symbol of the chaos that threatens to overwhelm us. The coastlines where our ancestors lived are now 100 meters below the surface, a lost world of drowned cities and forgotten landscapes. We are a species with amnesia. The flood stories are the fragmented, dreamlike memories of what we have forgotten. They are a message from our drowned ancestors, a warning passed down through the ages. They tell us that our civilization is a fragile island, and that the tide is always rising. But the stories are not just about the flood. They are about the ark. They are about the survivors. They are a testament to the resilience of life and the enduring power of knowledge. Ziusudra, listening to the whisper in the reed wall, is the hero of this story, not because he was chosen by a god, but because he chose to listen. He chose to act. He chose to build. He chose to preserve. The story of Ziusudra, the original flood hero, is the story of a choice. The choice to face the coming storm not with despair, but with purpose. The choice to abandon the material world to save the world of ideas. The choice to carry the seeds of the past into the future. It is the most important story we have ever told, and it is a story that we will have to learn to tell again, because the ice is melting, the seas are rising, and the whispers have begun once more. You are back on the beach, watching the tide come in. Each wave is a whisper, a faint echo of the great flood that reshaped our world. The story of Ziusudra is a mirror. In it, we see our deepest fears and our highest aspirations. We see the fragility of civilization, the awesome power of nature, and the quiet courage of those who choose to preserve knowledge in the face of chaos. The journey to understand this single ancient story has taken us to the edge of the world and to the dawn of time. We have discovered that our history is not a straight line, but a circle. That civilization is not a fortress, but a sandcastle, built and rebuilt between the tides of cosmic and geological change. The flood is not a myth, it is a memory that sleeps in our DNA, in our oldest stories, and in the layers of mud and ice that record the Earth's long and violent history. We end where we began, with a choice. The choice of Ziusudra, the choice of Noah, the choice of Manu. To listen or to ignore, to build or to be washed away. The ancient texts tell us that after the flood, the gods smelled the sweet savor of Ziusudra's sacrifice and regretted their destruction. They had destroyed their worshippers, and in doing so, they had diminished themselves. It is a profound lesson about the relationship between creator and creation, power and responsibility. The story of the flood is not just a warning about the fragility of life, it is a testament to its preciousness, and it is a reminder that the future is not something that happens to us. It is something we build, one plank, one nail, one act of preservation at a time. The whispers in the reeds continue. The question is, what will we do before the rain begins?